With that, Jim, take it away.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, David. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. Yeah, so I'd just like to talk through this. May be a presentation with a bit of a difference because, as the introduction has said, I go after scammers and I can give you a bit of an insight, maybe in a very unusual way, because over the last number of years, I've been able to really get inside the heads of some scammers. So hopefully, it'll come out in this presentation. So, I say I'll not give you much of an introduction. I've already talked about, David's given me the introduction about who I am. But what I will do is go through the types of scams that you will typically see. And I guess for credit unions, there'll be some which will be more prevalent than others. But there's a number of scams which have kind of a similar way of working. So I'll talk about those as well. I'll also give you a bit of an insight into who runs these sorts of scams. So it's not always apparent about who's behind some of the scams. But as I say, over the last number of years, I've been doing some digging in that area, and I can give you a bit of an insight as to which organizations are behind them. Also, I guess unusually, I have a method of combating these scams. And I'll talk a little bit about how I do that. And I guess as well, over the last number of years, I've been trying to approach banks and credit unions about some of the things I've observed. And I'm hoping there's maybe people in this audience who can maybe help a little bit with, given that this is a growing crime, maybe some of my observations you can maybe take back and perhaps change processes and procedures. That would be a real win if that could happen. So I'll talk a little bit about what I've observed when I've approached credit unions or banks. So without further ado, the introduction's already been done. If you want to have a look in more detail though at some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, if you just search for Jim Browning on Google, or youtube.com/Jim Browning, you'll see a lot of the material that I'm talking about. It's totally free on YouTube, and do have a look at some of that material. It's probably better to illustrate this as videos sometimes than just talking through it in a presentation. So I'll not linger on who I am, other than to say, yes, Jim Browning isn't my real name. I do have a proper real job. The YouTube bit is a bit of a spare time thing. But anyway, you can have a look on that YouTube channel. Say just Google Jim Browning. So this guy, this is a snippet of one of the videos that I've got online. And the guy on the top right is somebody called Jayant Sharma, and he's a scammer. And what he's doing at the moment is he's connecting to a victim's PC. It's hard to kind of figure this one out, but it's the bit in red in the middle is the victim's PC. The bit on the outside is Jayant's own machine. And what he's doing at the moment, and you can see this again in the video in detail, is talking through a very scripted routine where he will attempt to convince his victim that he's got some sort of problem, and ultimately will want him to either give him a payment to fix this problem, which doesn't exist, or he will try to get access to his bank account. Now I've just switched on Jayant's webcam so you can see him. And as I say, this is one of the things that I can do with a bit of experience whenever I get access to these guys. And before that happens, they will have had tried to scam me. So Jayant at some point would have tried the same scam on me. And I've managed to get access back to his PC and kind of record exactly how that scam works. So yes, as I say, it's just a screenshot of a scam in action. And as I say, you can see the full video on this if you look on YouTube, but it's an example of what can be done to kind of find out more about these scams. I was going to talk about what are tech support scams and how do they work, but obviously enough, as with most scams, it's all about getting money out of the victims. And the easiest way that the majority of these scammers will work is in one of three ways. And the first one, which I think probably most people will be familiar with, is a cold call. and it will claim to be from Microsoft or vaguely Windows support or something, saying that your computer has a problem. And I'm sure almost everyone has had that sort of call at some point. There's a variant of that which will give you a refund. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But there's another couple of ways that these guys ultimately get access to people's computers and then subsequently will try and get access to bank accounts. And the second type of scam is a pop-up. You may or may not have seen these, but if you browse the internet and perhaps mistype a URL, say Gmail instead of Gmail, then you may get some sort of advert popping up. And occasionally those adverts are maliciously crafted in a way that it will lock up your browser. I've got examples of this in just a second. But that's the second type, is a pop-up, and it will have a phone number on it. And generally, because it's locked your browser, you will find this pop-up very hard to get rid of. And in some people's cases, they will resort to phoning the number to get rid of that pop-up. But I'll talk about more of that in a second. And then the last type is a fake support number. And again, I'll give examples of this. So I have a few examples here. Sorry, this had a number of screenshots. It doesn't come through very well in the webinar. But if you're browsing the internet and you accidentally hit a wrong website, you could get a pop-up which may look something like this. At some point in that screen, there will be a phone number. I've got a UK one here, so it says 0800. It'll usually be 1-800 1888, and it will encourage the person to call that number. And usually these things have got a very loud audio playing in the background, either very loud beeping noise or even a recorded message to say, your computer has a virus, please phone this number. And I've listened in on quite a number of calls, and a lot of them you can still hear the audio playing in the background as the scammers receive these calls. So they're usually designed in a way that they both lock the browser and give a very audible warning. So that's one type. The second type I mentioned about fake support numbers. Now, if you just Google certain terms like free phone number for maybe like a well-known computer company like either Microsoft or Dell or whatever it happens to be, the results on Google can't always be trusted. So this particular page, I've searched for something called Norton Antivirus Tech Support Phone Number. And this was taken from just a few weeks ago. And okay, you'll see some UK phone numbers here. But the ones in green are legitimate websites, so something at norton.com. But everything else on this page, including the phone numbers, are all fake. And if you just glance at Google and didn't care too much about what the actual website is behind that, then you could well and probably will be speaking to a scammer. So if you phone, for example, this number, which is the top result on Google, you will be through to a call center in India, and the person on the end of that phone, their job is to try to scam you. So you have to be very aware that just Google search results can lead you to these scammers as well. But I think with this audience, I'll concentrate a bit more on the cold calls because that's typically where bank accounts are accessed. So cold calls, so there's several types of these, and as I say, I'm sure everybody's heard some of these at some point. And usually the older type of ones are your computer has a virus and you need to speak to whoever's on the end of that robocall. Either they leave a phone number or you press a button to speak to some agent. Or there's variants of this, and I've received a number of these recently myself. I've got a call which has said, for example, that we are Visa and we've seen some suspicious activity on your online account, and we've seen maybe like a $600 transaction, and again, press 1 to speak to an agent. And there's another variant of this, and it's particularly aimed at people who have perhaps fallen for some of these tech support scams before, and that's ones offering a refund. And again, this is just a variant of these scams where literally they'll say, look, we're going out of business and you paid for something before, and some people have, and they will offer some sort of lowish dollar amount in return. But of course, they've got to get access to your computer first. They can never just post you a check or something. And that's a prelude to a scam. So all of those types of scams, that's the first step in all of them. The second step is if you call that number or you type, if the scammer gets you to type something in, it's usually one of a remote access client. So I've listed a few here: support.me, log me in, TeamViewer, fast support. Basically, they will want to get access to the victim's PC, and they will give instructions to the victim what to type in, and they will ultimately get the victim to download remote access software, and the victim will then read out a number or be given a number, and when that happens, the scammer can get that remote access. So if you haven't seen any of these types of software, here's one in front, which is fastsupport.com. So the scammer will ask the victim, type in fastsupport.com, type in your name, I will give you a support key, they'll read it out, and as soon as the victim hits continue and installs this, the scammer will have remote access to the victim's PC. So once they have access to the victim's PC, then the next step is that there's usually a very scripted scam, and what they will have to do is get the victim ultimately to log into their bank account. And there's lots of different ways that they do that, the most common of which is simply to say, we've given you a payment of some kind, can you now log into your bank account to make sure that that payment has gone in? And once the victim does this, they'll type in their username and password. At that point, the remote access software allows the scammer to black out the victim's screen. And equally, they can tick a box to say, don't allow the victim to type anything either by their mouse or by their keyboard. And you can see that highlighted just at the bottom of the screen here. So when that happens and the victim is logged into their bank account, the black screen will prevent the victim from seeing anything, and there'll usually be some sort of story behind that. We're connecting to our secure server or whatever. But the long and short of it is the victim can't see the screen, but the scammer can. And ultimately, they will make good use of that. So when the scammer has access to the victim's PC and they're logged in, there's a few things that they can do. And the obvious one is that they add a payee and send some money to that payee. But as I say, that's probably the least likely thing that happens these days. It's quite often easy to kind of counteract that and indeed reverse that transaction. So in most cases, they're not likely to send money that way. But instead, when the screen is black, what they more typically do is register for a different online either bank account or some sort of financial institution. Typically things like Coinbase, which allows you to buy Bitcoin. And Coinbase, unlike most banks or credit unions, require you to submit documents by email. So they'll ask you to scan your passport, scan your driver's license, and they will accept that as valid identity details. And quite often the victims will say, right, your screen is black. In order for us to give you money back, we need to identify you. We need to make sure you are who you say you are. And would you mind putting your driver's license into your scanner there? And they will take the victim's own identity documents and use those, obviously without the victim's knowledge, register an account in their name using their credentials, but obviously only the scammer knows the credentials. And indeed, there's things like two-factor authentication sometimes there. They will use their own phones or even the victim's phone to get those details. They'll ask the victim sometimes to read out their two-factor PIN number, for example. So that's typically what happens. They'll register on some sort of financial institution like Coinbase or TransferWise or Western Union. And when they've done that, then obviously they can send money in whatever shape or form they want. The other way is to, particularly for refund scams, they will, and this is slightly more clever than the average one. The refund scam is a particularly nasty one because it's, first of all, believable, particularly if you have given money to scammers in the past. But what they will do is they will edit the page, they will temporarily black screen the victim, and they will edit the page to make it look as if they've added money into your account. So they may, for example, and I'll show an example of this. So again, it's a little bit easier to follow if you see what's happening on a video, and I've got plenty of that on YouTube. But if you're logged into your bank account, what they can do is, it may be hard to see here, if you right click on a web page, it is possible to edit the HTML, the website content, and make it look as if they've either added a transaction and kind of increased the amount of money in your bank account. And indeed, if it's an existing transaction, they'll simply edit the description of that to say this is our refund. And usually the way this scam works is they will promise $300, say, but they will accidentally, on purpose, add $3,000 or similar to a victim's bank account. And when that happens, they will claim that this wasn't intentional and they're going to need their money back because they'll lose their job. Of course, nothing's really happened. All they've done is temporarily edit the HTML. And of course, if they convince the victim that there really is extra money in their bank account, they rely on the good nature of possibly older people to return that money. But of course, they can't return the money in the normal way. They will ask the victim to go in and potentially buy a gift card. And again, this gift card is fast becoming the currency of choice when it comes to scams. So they'll usually ask the victim not to kind of transfer money from their bank account. They'll be told to go to your local Walmart or Target or whatever and buy gift cards to return to them. And that's a good way of laundering money. So you've probably seen that and maybe even have experience of people who have been asked to go and buy gift cards, typically iTunes or Android or Target or whatever the gift card is. Either way, it's a good way of cleanly laundering money if you're a scammer. And it's got to the extent where, particularly if it's, there's the IRS scams are the typical one, that they will go in and say, you owe us tax, but you've got to go out and buy a gift card to return that. Most people are aware of that, but they also use the same technique when it comes to getting into your bank account and making it look as if they've given you too much money. So that's an easy way for the scammer to launder money. And obviously, if they get the gift card number, they will ask the victim to scratch off the panel at the back. And if they read out that number, then they can easily buy goods or transfer it in whatever way they want. But it's a clean way to launder money. So if a victim did happen to fall for one of those scams, then they will pretty much instantly, particularly for gift cards, pretty much instantly lose that money. If it was a Coinbase account set up in their name, potentially they could basically, whatever dollar value that has been transferred over, they will almost immediately convert that into Bitcoin. And when it's in Bitcoin, then they can pretty much anonymously transfer that to whatever Bitcoin accounts they have. So again, a clean way of laundering money. And if you're a tech support scammer and you've managed to convince someone that your computer really did have a problem, if you have one of those pop-ups, for example, and you can demonstrate that you've got rid of that pop-up, then a lot of people who fall for that scam actually believe that they've given them a good service. And a lot of the victims don't even realize that they are victims of this tech support scam. I've come across a lot of people in that category. Some as well will do malicious things on your computer. Most don't. Probably only maybe 10% will actually try and damage a computer. But if the scammer gets frustrated or the victim actually catches on what's going on, a few of them will actually go and delete your files or rarely plant a virus, but certainly could do damage to your computer. Syskey is one way that they would do that. So I got a quote from one of the victims. This is just a guy called Richard Peace, who is a fairly typical victim, I would say. This people who are most likely to fall for this sort of scam tend to be over the age of 70. People who are maybe less familiar with computers or maybe are more trusting. I don't know, but either way, it's mostly over the age of 70 is the typical victim of this sort of scam. And you can see here what he's written, but basically, he's a retiree. It was all the money he had, and it has a devastating effect on victims, as you can imagine. I'm sure people in this audience have more experience of that than I have, even. But I guess when it comes to what happens after this, I've got another slide on what I think banks or credit unions could do better. But there's basic information that if you do come across one of these victims, what they should do, and obviously remove the remote access software, replace credit card information because quite often that will be compromised. And it's all the usual stuff if someone has their bank details compromised. But I think what's more important to me, sorry, I just want to check time here as well. I take it, David, I have 30 minutes ready to complete the presentation, then time for questions. Is that correct?
That's correct, and you're doing just fine.
Okay, no, that's
Yep,
fine. That's all right. Just want to make sure I've got the right time. So this is the most important bit for me. I've been able to intercept a lot of these scams in action, and what would be great would be as if something positive came out of that, because I've been able to give intelligence back to banks or credit unions about some of their accounts being used for scams. So, for example, I will find out that a certain bank account is being used initially to receive funds, um, and there doesn't seem to be a consistent way, in my view, that if you phone up a bank or credit union and report one of these fraudulent accounts or account being used for fraud, that in my view anyway, much happens about it. And I've actually been witnessing live a scam. I've tried to phone the bank in question. Maybe UK banks aren't as good as ones in the US, but literally I've been told, well, we're not interested in that, and if there's a problem like this, go to the police, which I always find bizarre, particularly if I've been able to give details like, look, I can see what the online transaction number is, I can see this person's account number, I can see this scammer actually trying to transfer funds to another account. Can you do anything at least to freeze that and then get the police involved? And I've always hit brick walls when it comes to that. And I would love to see some sort of mechanism where intelligence could be acted on quickly. And say I've never come across that, and I would be interested to hear others' views on it. And it probably doesn't apply to credit unions or banks as much, but at very least the online sites which require people's identity, say, to be emailed, there's never any follow-up call to make sure that the person who has just submitted those identity documents are aware that they've registered an account. And it's a simple step. All it needs is a phone call, but that does not happen. Things like Coinbase and TransferWise and everything else just don't seem to do that. They always seem to be, well, we're never going to phone anyone to make sure this is legitimate registration. It's just either it looks legit and we'll accept it, and there's never any, for example, follow-up call. And as I say, if there was a mechanism for credit unions to act on some intelligence passed to them and maybe even share that intelligence, I think it would bring a lot of benefit. But I guess you guys are probably in a better position than me. So in the last 2 minutes, I'll talk very quickly, I'll skip past this, about what I do. I'll maybe go back here. What I do is, again, just to get the kind of in-depth intelligence on this, is I set myself up with a virtual computer. make it stealthy so it looks like a real computer. And if you're not aware of what a virtual machine is, it's a computer within a computer. It's a safe environment. And I deliberately let scammers connect to that. And when they do that, outside that software computer, I can monitor what goes on. I run something called Wireshark, which gives me what's going in and out of this computer and importantly where it comes from. So things like IP addresses. I set it up in a way that I can actually sometimes, not always, reverse that connection. And when I can reverse that connection, I can literally see what the scammer sees. I can have full access potentially to their PC, see whatever files they've got on there, see where they are. And again, you'll see this if you look on YouTube, just how much information you can get. And as I say, to date, I've only had, with the intelligence I've gathered, I've only had one person who's been arrested because they're in the UK. And unfortunately, most of the scammers come from, this is just an example of what Wireshark shows. Down at the bottom here, you can see this connection was from Delhi. But I've kind of plotted out where most of these organizations are. And most are in around, this is Delhi and Gurgaon, the suburb, the odd one in Kanpur and Kolkata. That's where most of them are. This is a couple of years out of date. There's probably a whole load more I can add to this. There's a few more in the south in Mumbai and Chennai, but that's just in my own experience where these tend to be. But 99% of these scam call centers are in India. This is an example of a typical scammer, a guy called Moshin Wakar. I managed to find his own passport on his PC. They tend to be younger guys and women out of college, maybe can't get a job, and these call centers provide very good wages compared to normal call center jobs. There's huge incentives if you can scam people. And this guy was employed by a company called Raj Ratan Info Solutions. Now he's since left, but this gives you a typical profile of the type of people who run those scams. Say they're younger and again, they're just out of college. Just the final slide is about how much of a big business this is. And this is a slide, again, I took from a scammer's computer. And this organization do tech support for something called reimage.com, which is a bit of software which is entirely designed to scare people into buying support. So it's all fake software. And a little bit like fake news, it can generate a huge amount of income. This is the figure, $1.8 million, is not rupees, is the monthly target for this organization, and they regularly exceed that amount. So $1.8 million per month from just one call center employing about 300 people, albeit, in Delhi in a month. And that's why it's huge business, and that's why when I disrupt these guys, it really does have significant impact on their organization. And that's part of the reason why I keep my own name out of this deliberately. But it is huge business. So I think I'm about 2 minutes over, but I'll maybe open up to if anyone has questions on that.
Thank you so much, Jim. This is really eye-opening for me. I'm saying a lot of wows back here while I'm on mute. I have a question.
Sure.
And if you guys want to go ahead and start submitting questions, you can, and we can ask Jim. We usually take them at the end, but I think we're doing good on time. So,
okay.
But are most of the targets that these call centers are hitting, are most of them U.S. targets?
It's mostly English-speaking countries, so US would definitely be the biggest, but certainly, I mean, I'm in the UK myself, and I get lots and lots of these calls as well. So it tends to be Australia, UK, and US, but they're actually finding that they're branching out a bit more. And believe it or not, the organization who have raised this $1.8 million a month, they are actually training their agents to speak Japanese for the entire purpose that it's a fairly untapped market. And because they follow more or less a script with all of their scams, it's actually quite easy to translate the scam into Japanese and try and scam that area as well. But no, absolutely, it is mostly US, yes. but they're catching up on other countries because, as I say, it looks like an untapped market for them.
Wow. Good information. I got another question that just came in asking, how are people targeted for these scams?
Yeah, and so I see one by the Q&A here as well. There is not really, apart from the refund scams, there isn't really a way of targeting people. It is literally these organizations try to get as many valid phone numbers as possible. And because the majority of them are in India, unfortunately, a lot of Indian call centers handle genuine data for large companies quite often. And some of them will steal that data. Or indeed, you may even find that there are certain call centers who randomly ring people, and if they get a response at all, that number is marked as being valid, and again is sold among a lot of call centers. So in a lot of cases, it's not targeted, it's entirely random. They will go through phone books when they can get them. They will make use of whatever data is pushed to them. And yeah, it rarely is targeted. Sometimes, if you have fallen for a scam before, the company who has got a lot of those scam victims will resell or have that data stolen, and it will end up in other call centers. And literally, I have coded a fake name to, say, like a survey call, and months later, I will hear that same name echoed back to me from a completely different call center. So the data works its way around these places.
Wow.
So
Another.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to go ahead.
I was going to say that there's Julie Han has asked a question as well about I saying local police will get involved.
Sure.
Yeah, the police one is interesting, and I've had personal experience of this. If the scam is entirely within, say, the UK or US, then the police typically can and will get involved. And the one and only arrest, for example, for me has been that a guy had set up a company in the UK with the idea that he would take money into his account, but then put about 90% of that back to where the call center was in India. He would keep about 10% himself. And he deliberately set up this company with that in mind. And the only person to get arrested was the guy in the UK, because I reported this to the UK police. He was ultimately arrested, but the 90% of the victim's money, which went to India, was never recovered, and no one was ever arrested there. So yeah, it depends on where the scam is, and unfortunately, because most of them are entirely within India, then in my experience, nothing happens there at all. And that's part of the reason why I put the YouTube videos up is I go to the police, say this is happening. I wait for them to respond. Typically they don't respond, and then I put the YouTube video out in the hope that it will disrupt the organizations because nobody else is doing much.
Right, right. I want to do two more questions that I see
Sure.
came in, and then we'll move on and do our industry update, which is usually about 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
And then we can come back and answer more. Are you going to be able to stay on
I'll stay on,
for
yeah,
the
no,
rest of
no
this?
problem. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, excellent. So this one question is asking, which we kind of had this same question in the room, if we're receiving pop-up messages or if the members are receiving pop-up messages, what would be the best way to get rid of them? Do you push the X or do you just shut your computer down? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah. If you know about computers, you can press Control-Alt-Del, you get a task list, and you can kill the browser without having to switch the computer off. That's the easiest way if you know about computers. Unfortunately, most people don't, and knowing that killing the whatever browser task is running is easiest, the next simplest way is to hold your finger on the power button, switch it right off, turn it on again, and it will disappear. That's the easiest.
All right, and then this last question I'll ask for now, but I'm going to come back and ask the other one. So if you guys are still asking questions and I haven't asked them, don't worry, we're going to come back at the end. Besides the stealing of money, do you find that they open credit cards in victims' names or take out large loans? Maybe that's just a common thing.
In my experience, no, it's kind of a hit and run. So they'll try to get as much money out of a victim whilst they have access to their computer. I have seen literally thousands of credit card numbers in plain text, in spreadsheets, on scammers' PCs, and they don't seem to act on that. So they will take depends on the organization, I guess, but literally I have passed on to the police thousands of compromised credit cards. So no, not really. I think they will try and get as much as away with much as they can in the short term. But I think rarely will they start to like clone identities and clone cards. Not in my experience anyway. I could be very wrong on this, but I think from certainly from Indian call centers, that rarely happens.
Gotcha. All right.